The 1980, 81, and 82 Double Dip Recession from Group 3 and 5. The end of the 1970s brought troubling times leading to the early 80s Double Dip Recession. The first recession was heralded with the Iranian Revolution, where American hostages were captive to the Ayatollah Khomeini's new government. The political disruption lowered oil output, while President Carter ceased Iranian imports. Reagan soon after succeeded Carter and ushered in a sharp contrast to the prior fiscal policies. After the Iran-Iraq War had started in 1980, Iran oil production virtually stopped. The shock to the U.S. oil supply significantly raised energy costs. These large increases in energy came at a time of stagflation. Stagflation is a serious economic problem largely thought by Keynesians not to be able to exist because usually high unemployment results with low inflation. Much of the inflation was driven by sharp increases in the energy costs. The oil shock was a catalyst to the recession. Stagflation was, however, the more serious and difficult problem to deal with, and that made the recession endure. Fed Chairman Paul Volcker adopted a policy to tighten the money supply as a means to control inflation. This was an intentional move where the U.S. prime rate rose to 21.5%. Under this model, domestic consumption and business investment were largely fettered, causing unemployment to rise even further. Construction and housing were especially hard hit. However, it did seem to put inflation in check. Before the 1980s recession, the government was trying to tame inflation by using some restrictive monetary policy. This obviously was a key contributor to the recession. In order to correct the situation of the economy, the government decided to cut taxes. The tax cuts were done with the belief that the tax cuts would help stimulate larger amounts of supply in the market. This, in turn, would increase business investments and earnings. The government also would increase spending on its own as it increased its defense in the budget to counter the threats from the Soviets. However, these immediate reactions did not immediately pay dividends, and the economy went into what is considered the second part of the recession. Once inflation came back in line to a reasonable rate of 3 to 5%, things began to improve. There were also agreements with countries to control the amounts of exports that were sent to the U.S. This encouraged an increase in business investment. However, this recovery did not come free of any long-term negative consequences. Throughout this, the national deficit tripled. As the government was increasing their spending in areas like defense and healthcare, budget deficits increased significantly. Finally, one additional result of this recession was the widening of the gap between the rich and the poor. These tax breaks started to tax all income groups as equal percentages, which caused a widening effect of that income gap. The recession was felt in many areas of the economy and made a few situations even worse. The savings and loan industry was one area that was particularly hard hit. In 1979, S&Ls began losing money due to the spiraling interest rates. In 81, due to out-of-control interest rates, 747 out of 3,234 S&Ls failed, and as the S&Ls continued to lose money, eventually ending up with $4.1 billion in the red. Prior to 1981, the government took on the responsibility for the economy and kept private industry separate. With the recession in 1981, the government incorporated the private sector much more into mainstream economics and also promoted free trade and open markets. With the deregulation of markets and the government promoting the private sector economics, the economy was forever changed as neoliberal economic policies, which are still being used today. As with the S&L crisis, Latin America was also hard hit by the recession. In the 60s and 70s, Latin American countries were borrowing billions of dollars to create infrastructure and make drastic improvements. The countries all had flourishing economies, so international lenders were not hesitant to lend. When the interest rates started rising in the early 80s, these countries' debt payments also began to rise. This made it increasingly difficult for these countries to repay those debts. Banks were eventually restructuring these loans, but the effects were unmistakable. Latin American countries had to halt industrialization and hurt the wages and buying power of the middle class. It was argued that in light of the Middle East political unrest, control of U.S. oil prices ought to have been ended earlier. Evening out the supply to demand would have allowed manufacturers to be more competitive, increasing domestic jobs and reducing imports. The Fed's policy to fight inflation was also criticized. As inflation jumped to an all-time high, the Fed infused cash into the economy only during the election. While they did enjoy a short-term spike, soon a reduction resumed. The argument here is that they could have been more stable by lowering the amount of cash infusions. Reagan sought to raise revenues and spur growth by lowering taxes. This was harshly criticized because it went against the conventional wisdom that lower taxes meant less revenue and was called politically naive by the former Carter administration. Rather than deregulate, they argued that higher taxes allowed for a greater distribution of wealth to the poor, who would then spend those dollars on consumption. They also argued that increased fuel controls would benefit domestic producers, in theory, holding down the cost of goods to consumers. In summary, the recessions started with a shock to the energy costs, which turned into stagflation. Stagflation forced the Fed to change its monetary policy. Later, changes in the fiscal policy helped to boost the country back towards growth. Thank you, and this ends our presentation.